Okay, so hi everybody. This is fabulous to see you all. Thanks for coming into this Zoom workshop, the introduction to method of levels. It was Eva's kind of prompts that kind of made this an international enterprise, as it were. And she and I have been planning this over the last couple of months. And Eva's been refining a lot of the slides and what have you. Thanks for all your patience with all the technology with this. Thanks to Sarah Tai as well, who had hoped to co-run this, but her involvement is there very heavily within the slides. And of course to Tim Carey, who developed method of levels, and we're using some of his work in this material as well, obviously in tandem with Bill Powers. Okay, so we've got two halves. The first hour, going to do a little bit of an introduction, which that was kind of it, and do the background and method of levels, why we need this new kind of therapy, and really just explain the basics of control. Okay. As I say, if you have any questions for me, then do just put them up on the chat. Eva will answer them initially, then she'll draw my attention to any that still need sorting. We'll have a break at about 2 to 3, and then we'll come back for another hour where we will cover the other two principles of PCT, conflict and reorganization, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how to do method levels. Now, thank you to all of you for accessing the preparation materials, and I'm sure you will vary in how much you've accessed them, but the intention is that this workshop is there to be complemented by you watching those videos and having a go at that. And so it all works together alongside the facilitating sessions that you've got to what I think allow you to get started with this way of talking to people and helping them. And that's why there's going to be some plans, again, on the preparation materials about what I'd hope you do before you have the small group sessions. If you haven't signed up to a small group session on Doodle, then we should put the link on that, and Eva can do that at some point during this. But we've got a fair few people signed up to that already. And it's great to see 63 of you now online. So I'm going to get started with a bit of background. Okay, so some of you will know this. Method of levels developed alongside perceptual control theory back in the 1950s when Bill Powers was developing it, and he actually used this method of talking to another person about his experiences with his friend Kirk Sadley. He used it to both work out how to develop the theory, and based on the theory he developed this method. So it worked in tandem with the whole theory, and it's been a long time until it actually became a recognized trainable mental health approach. There were other things, there were some kind of incarnations of it, but really it was the 1990s when Tim Carey came across PCT, contacted Bill Powers, and worked on this distilled version of method of levels, which is what I'm sharing with you today. Although I came across PCT probably in the late 90s, I think, I didn't come across method levels till about 2005 when I met up with Tim Carey. He came to Manchester, and everything changed at that point for myself and Sarah in terms of how we did clinical interventions and research. Since then, we've trained well over 1,000 people internationally. I think a lot of people get familiar with this, but they don't necessarily make it their main approach. So there's probably around 100 people who are using this internationally as their main approach. So you're fairly unique in using this as your main approach if that's your intention. But in those short 14, 15 years, we have been applying method levels across very wide services within mental health, within schools, businesses, prisons, and with Tom's work recently, even in forum theatre, so that the use of method levels is very broad. We've also published a lot of work on this, and of course Tim Carey published a lot of the early practical, pragmatic trials. We've not conducted a large control trial, mainly because we haven't had the funding to do it. But that's why you won't see method levels in some of the clinical guidelines. That's the main reason. Okay. So hopefully that's enough background to get people kind of hooked in as to why we're doing it. Doing method levels is about taking a view on well-being and mental health. And it's one that I think, although there are some resemblances to what's gone before, I think the vigour and the kind of the single-mindedness that we pursue it is unique to PCT. And you could think of it as a metaphor of the fact that if you break a leg and your leg is mending, it mends itself, but we put a plaster around it. We create an environment that helps your leg mend itself, okay? So therapy is like that for us. It's something that we do in and around the client in an ongoing way to help them mend themselves, okay? It's not something we do to them, that we tell people, that we actively change them or push them in any particular direction. But we work out what's going to be the best shaped plaster cast for this person at this point, and how we're going to change that as we go through this conversation to help them help themselves, okay? And some people might also argue there's lots of other therapies out there. Why do we need one? But the rates of other therapies in terms of recovery are fairly modest. A lot of them require screening and diagnosis, which one may have an independent argument for, but there's certainly the case that this can get in the way for some people, especially when you talk to people with lived experience. And partly that's because we know that the change occurs in the first session. People have lots of different diagnoses very often, and some people really don't like this kind of feeling of being diagnosed and made and analysed as a problem by someone else. They just want that space to work things through for themselves, and that's what MOL does. And I was literally providing method levels to a friend of mine in Colombia yesterday, who's had hours and hours of therapy for about 2 decades. It was the first chance that I'd actually got to help him, and he couldn't believe the difference between what I was asking him in that 40 minutes that we were talking online and the years of therapy that he'd had. And he said, the fact is, when I talk about my problems to my therapist, I can talk around it, and when I think they're going to get onto the point of it, I manage to distract them because I'd like to avoid things. I don't like to talk about what's really at the root of it. But you didn't let me do that. Every time there was something there, you asked me about it, and I wanted you to do that. And it wasn't because I was a friend that he let me ask those questions. It was because I was a bit rude and interrupted with some very genuinely curious questions. And that's what you've got to get used to in method levels. You've also got to get used to recognizing that people determine their own process and speed of change. It is impossible that everybody with a certain problem will get well in 8 sessions or 16 sessions. These numbers have been created by group averages in clinical guidelines. Now, they might be the best average, they might not, but what's certain is that that exact number is not the optimum for each individual that gets therapy. So for method levels, we let people have the number of sessions they want, whether that's very few or very large. And the other thing you see in other therapies, and again, I'm sure there's a good reason for this, other therapies often change over time and pick up new techniques and new tools and what have you. Method levels is never going to change because you just follow 2 principles and everything else is up to you. There are no techniques. You're just yourself following those 2 goals, trying to be as to the point and as efficient and as client-led as you can. So it won't change. So that's why as Eva said to me before, it's a terrible marketing thing to commercialize method levels therapy because you can't sell the next version because it's always going to be the same. And we're trying to get it the same as when Bill did it in the 1950s, Tim refined it 20 years ago, and we hope to keep us true to that for the rest of time, for better or for worse, but that's what we've signed up to. Okay, so I've already mentioned that method levels is about booking your own appointment. It's about control. The client talks about what they want to talk about, the problem of their choice. The counsellor, the therapist, tracks what they're doing really closely. So if you're going to put some effort in, don't make that effort interpretation, formulation, advice. Make that effort into listening and actively tracking the words that they say and the behaviours that you witness, okay? And you keep that curiosity going throughout. You have to be genuinely curious that anything or the next thing they say could be completely different from what thing they said before. And you're just going to observe that. It's like, imagine watching a dinosaur hatch that you've never seen before. You've got to have that level of curiosity and open-ended fascination of what they're going to come up with next. You have no idea what they're going to say. You can't second guess it, okay? Keep that curiosity. As I say, there's no specific techniques. It assumes that change happens spontaneously, and I'll explain how that happens later. And it assumes that people know when they don't need method levels anymore, okay? So, part of the way I was looking for something that was going to distill the active ingredients of therapy. So was Tim, and I imagine so was Bill. And we all knew that other therapies do work, but they seem to have a whole mix match of methods and techniques that sometimes work for some people and not for others. So could there be some active ingredient that if we stick to those principles that could work for each person that we apply them to? And that's what we're doing. How do we help people that are stuck with something by applying some core principle? And of course, that core principle for Bill Powers was control. The idea that life itself is about control. That in order for a living thing, whether that be a human or an animal or another living thing, to keep going, it needs to specify what milieu, what environment it needs. And to do that, it needs to sense it, and it needs to change things around it to keep that environment the way it needs to be to survive, to propagate, to self-organize, and to reproduce. And the researcher, Tom Bourbon, who is also Tim Carey's supervisor, put it this way: it's an uninterrupted process of specifying, creating, and maintaining. A process in which all that is not essential is free to change, preventing change in what is essential. So it's the idea that you've got your eye on two things. You've got your goal, what you want, and then you've got this variation, this means to achieve what you want, that needs to stay free to change and open-ended, okay? And it's that way of thinking about any kind of issue or problem that is key. And I'm going to say a bit more about control in a second, but just to kind of drum it home that, before any clinicians touched upon this, Bill Powers knew, and maybe it was because his wife was a counsellor, maybe it was because his mother worked with patients with psychosis, he knew that psychological breakdown, psychopathology, chronic distress, whatever you want to call it, was the loss of control. And if we can help people regain that control, then we can help them to recover. And so that was one of the reasons, not just because he was an engineer who used these systems, but that was one of the reasons why his work was all about control. And a simple way of kind of casting what Tom Bourbon said, and this is a really nice way that Tim Carey introduces PCT, is that it's the Goldilocks theory of life. It's about getting your preferences and getting them just right for yourself. So like with Goldilocks, getting the temperature of a porridge, not too hot, not too cold, we're getting it just right. And the idea is that we have preferences for all kinds of things, whether it be the foods and drinks we like, whether it be the tone of voice that we use, or the distance that we sit from someone when we're talking to them, or even the kind of partner we want, or the kind of value we want in ourselves. All of these things are preferences, and we have to have some way of organizing these preferences, these desires and needs in our minds. And that's where the idea of a hierarchy comes in. So the idea is that we have these many different preferences, and if you think about them, some are a bit sort of specific and short term about, you know, the flavour of ice cream, about where you want to go for lunch today, and some of these are much more long term or much more abstract, like the kind of person you want to be or the kinds of lifestyle you want to have. How would we organise those in some way? And so in PCT we have the hierarchy, okay? And the hierarchy involves the concrete stuff at the bottom and the most abstract and self-definitional stuff at the top. So the idea is that we organise it in that way, and a really simple way of working your way around your own hierarchy is to ask how, what and why questions, okay? So what is what you're doing right now? How is going down levels and looking at, you know, how are we achieving that thing that we're doing? So if you want to listen to this workshop, how are you doing that in terms of, you know, accessing the software and navigating your way through the computer and listening to things? The why is going up levels. Why do you want to access this workshop? You know, to help people, to be a good psychologist, to be a good counsellor, etc. And so the idea is that the way that our psyche is organised is this hierarchy of wants, okay? Unlike certain other kind of ways of conceptualising, it's not particularly about beliefs or schema or attitudes. They might approximate to it, but really just try and think in wants and levels of wants when you're thinking of PCT and method levels. Okay, so if that's the case, and we're trying to get everything we experience in these ways we want them to be, you could say that we're all control freaks, okay? And the word control gets bandied around in everyday language, but also in psychology in some quite negative ways. But it's about the way that we control and how we balance the control that really determines whether those methods of control are going to be working for us or not. So I'm going to, given that I think this is quite a nice spot before I get a bit more technical again and do a video, and we're well ahead in terms of time.
But there was a question earlier that may be interesting, is what does method of levels mean? Why is the name method of levels? And I think you can talk a bit about that as well.
Okay, I mean, you probably need to ask, we can't ask Bill Powers that, because he initially called it an experiment with levels before it became a therapeutic technique. And that's because he was experimenting with questions to see whether it led him to discover new perceptual levels, new ways, or new aspects of his input, of his experience, to focus on that were a level above the level below, and that's where the hierarchy comes in. So he would start by sort of describing the shape of something and talk to his friend Kirk about it, and realize that actually this shape changed over time, and maybe that was some kind of change in shape, which he then called transition, which he could then sort of notice going up a level, and he used that to then start to describe what the qualities of that level would be. Now, when we use method levels clinically, we aren't thinking, oh, which of Bill Powers' levels is my client up to at the moment? Is he talking about, you know, programs? Is he talking about sequences? Is she talking about relationships? Is she talking about events? They do have names, but if we as a therapist get too stuck on those labels, we're going to get lost in complexity. So the important thing therapeutically is to be following the rules, which are following the 2 goals of MOL. You will notice people go up levels as they're doing the method levels, but your goal isn't to push them up there or to even make them aware that they've gone up levels. You will just notice that happen. And we'll cover the theory in a minute, but it's because when you're in conflict, you need to go to the level above to resolve the conflict, that ultimately someone will go up a level from where their problem is to solve it. So that's kind of why it's called method levels. You're going to have to go a level above the problem to solve it. But in method levels, you're not going to, you know, launch the person there or even use those terms to get them there. You just want to get the engine running, get them talking about stuff and catching where their own awareness goes, so that when they go to that level, you notice it and get them to elaborate on what they notice from that perspective. So don't worry if you start doing method levels and someone doesn't go up levels for the whole session, because your job isn't to push them up there. Your job is to get them talking about problem, notice disruptions, which we'll cover, and they will go up levels in that during that process. So as you see why I didn't explain the origins early on, because you have to explain the whole theory to explain why it's called that.
All right. There's 3 more questions. I will post them, and you can see what you can do with that. One is self-therapy possible? For example, using MOL as a do-it-yourself guide. Can you talk a bit about that?
Very, very quick one. The answer is yes and no, in that we certainly have experience of people, both clients and therapists, who are therapists who use it as a client, both of them saying that, you know, since doing this more, I'm noticing myself asking myself these questions and being more reflective about my problems and noticing the conflicts and the disruptions and that kind of thing. So it seems to improve people's propensity to do it, and people seem to nudge along that way. But at the same time, whenever someone who's done a lot of method levels as a client does it again, they say, oh, it was so much more useful to say that out loud to you and to hear myself and to get your questions coming to me. So yes, self-therapy is possible, but it seems that engaging in this open expression and questioning enhances it. So how do clients respond to the term method levels when introduced to therapy and mental health? Is that next one? To be honest, we've not laboured the name of it particularly, and we just explain what's involved, and we try not to kind of waste the time in the session doing a lot of explanation, so we'll just give people things to read on it, and really don't get hung up on what it's called. Is a simple way of answering that one.
I was wondering that maybe that's something for discussion later, if it's it's a complicated name, or is there something wrong with the name, or what are the associations there? But we can.
And also that next question about, do you need to keep in mind that you're searching for a conflict within the client? I guess we'll be talking about conflicts in a bit, won't we?
Yeah.
So I guess we just want other questions that, if you've got them now, that relate to how far we've got so far.
Yeah, I'll keep the questions for later, and you can continue.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, if you
right?
can save the ones that are relevant for later.
Yeah.
Anybody got anything else for now before I move on to talk about control? Okay, this is super.
Nothing in the chat. I think you can continue.
Yeah, super. And it's great to see 80 of you now. It's brilliant. So thank you so much for being part of this. Okay, so why is control important? Well, again, some of you will know this. Homeostasis, the biological system that keeps us alive is a control process, and it works through something called negative feedback control, which is quite simple in its basics. It's about having some kind of standard. So, for example, your body temperature of 37 degrees, comparing that against what your current levels are. So maybe you're a bit cold, you're at 35 degrees, and then that difference drives actions that do something to act against disturbances or things in the environment to reduce that difference. So you'll shiver if you're too cold, and that'll bring your temperature back to your desired body temperature. Homeostasis is going on at multiple levels in your body, mainly through your brainstem, but also probably intracellularly. You're keeping things like your blood sugar concentrations right. That's why we need to use insulin for people with diabetes. Your salt ion concentrations. There's lots of different physiological variables that your body, through the lower parts of your brain, is keeping within these correct ranges. Okay, if your body didn't do that, you'd definitely be dead. Okay, arguably also, and this is where PCT comes in, you're doing exactly the same process, but through another loop, and this loop goes out through your body muscles, and also to some degree through your glands, into the outside environment, okay, which is your body, the objects around you, the people around you, the digital interfaces, and back in again through your senses. And that's happening in a continuous process as well. And your brain is in charge of that. It's constantly comparing those experiences with how it wants them to be, and changing your outward actions all the time to make those experiences just as you like them to be. Okay? So in its simplest terms, PCT is homeostasis, but it's just going out through the outside world rather than through your bloodstream. And I remind people, if you weren't doing that, you wouldn't have body posture, you wouldn't be able to keep your head upright, you'd just be slumped on the floor, you'd probably die very soon as well. So we need this kind of control through behavior as well. But the thing is, most of the time we're doing these things, I bet you weren't even aware that you're keeping your head upright and your body upright as we were talking, and focusing your eyes on where you wanted to focus it. So we're doing this control completely unconsciously most of the time. So imagine how shocking it feels when you lose that overnight. You suddenly can't control the things you wanted to control. You can't get out of bed. You can't keep your arms kind of in a normal way. You find that your thoughts or your words don't come to you as they do normally. You're going to feel pretty scared and vulnerable and want help. And arguably that's what happens in various different mental health problems. You lose control over something you had control over before, and you didn't even know you were doing it, and somehow you've got to regain that control. Okay? But let's talk a little bit more about the specifics, and I will do a screen share for this. Okay? What I'm going to do is ask you to watch a short video. Okay? And in this video, I'm the person on the right, and there's a volunteer on the left. We've both got pens in our hands. Some of you have seen this. Don't kind of shout out an answer if you've seen it already. What I want you to do is guess what the person on the left, the volunteer, was told to do in this video, okay? So let me do the old shared screen thing, see if this works. Can people see that on their screen?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no errors.
Play it twice, okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Lovely.
Can you repeat the instruction again?
Yeah, just watch it and have a think about what the person on the left was instructed to do, okay? Bear in mind that I was the person on the right. Both people had to write on the page, but I gave that person with the green pen another instruction. I said, make sure you keep doing this. And they said, okay, and they followed that instruction throughout this video. Now, many of you, or some of you, will have seen this. Anyone who hasn't seen this before, do you want to unmute yourself and suggest what that person on the left was instructed to do?
Do the opposite of what you were doing.
Okay, okay. So a very common reaction is to, or way of understanding that is to think that the person on the left was told to do the opposite of what I was doing. Do you want to put your hand up or nod your head if you also thought it was to do the opposite? Few people, yes, it's quite a common one, that it's to do the opposite. Unfortunately,
there's another idea at the
okay, yeah, that's right. I won't give the answer away yet. But
So,
unfortunately, that's not right. It wasn't to do the opposite of me, even though that's, again, what it looks like.
It wasn't to mirror you?
To mirror me. Anyone else thought it was to mirror me?
What's
Yeah,
the same?
Copy me?
Or the image, mirror the image, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Another really common one, to mirror the image, to copy it, okay? Another really common one is to think that the person on the left...
Someone's got an insight.
I'm going to mute you all for a moment before you break the answer. Yeah, to draw a kangaroo is one really common one, to draw some particular object on the left. So we've got to do the opposite, to mirror, to copy, to draw a particular object. About 95% of people get those answers, okay?
There's also the idea of keeping the same distance or a certain tension in the rubber band.
Yeah. That one is closer because it is about keeping something, but it's Lee. I'm sure Lee's seen this before, but it's Lee who guessed the right answer, which is to keep the dot. The dot on the page at the same point as the knot of the rubber band. So what I'm going to do is show that video again, okay? Yeah. So can you see now that the knot and the dot are pretty close, and as soon as the knot goes away, the person does what they need to do to keep it to the dot. So it pretty much keeps the knot, keeps over the dot throughout it. Okay? People see that now. Okay. So even though it looks like a lot of things, most of those answers, when people saw that, were not correct at all. They were things they saw, but they were not what the instruction was, what that person thought they were doing, what they were doing, and what they remember doing. Like if you ask that person afterwards, which I do when I do this live, they can't remember drawing a particular picture. They're not particularly trying to do the opposite of the other person. They're just trying to keep the knot over the dot, okay? So now imagine that knot over the dot is trying to keep your anxiety levels at 0, okay? Imagine that now you have one goal in life, and it's to keep 0 levels of anxiety, okay? What are you going to do to keep your anxiety levels at 0? You might, not go to anything that makes you a bit scared. If someone starts to talk about something scary, change the subject. Don't look at people who make you feel anxious. And after all that, you might go home and have a stiff drink, So there are many different things that you might do to try and keep your anxiety at 0. But what I'm not saying is that mental health problems are always caused by people trying to keep their anxiety at 0, okay? But what people are doing is trying to control something that matters to them. It might be that they want to live their life to believe that something terrible that happened to them never really happened. So anytime something reminds them even a tiny bit about that terrible thing, then they'll do whatever they need to do, again, in that situation, to not think about that traumatic memory. It might be to change the subject. It might be to kind of distance themselves mentally. It might be to try and suppress a thought, to try and block an emotion, to try and numb the pain in other ways, etc., etc. Okay? So we're not interested in the behaviour specifics for PCT, because that's really going to vary between people, and it's going to vary within the same person over time. Okay, but we are interested in the fundamental, that they're trying to control stuff, and we want them to know what they're trying to control, and we want to help them balance the things they're trying to control with all the other things that they want to control in their lives. Okay, so I'm going on to the slide now, which is the diagram of perceive, compare, act. Okay, and this is a very oversimplified loop that describes PCT, but it does get to the essence of it. The importance of it is that it's a closed loop. Okay, so we're constantly perceiving aspects of ourselves and the world, comparing it to our reference points, which are our goals, our standards, our ways we want them to be, and we're acting to change that or to reduce that difference, just as the rest of your brain is for things going on in your body. And we're doing that continuously, and that's why Bill Powers described behaviour as the control of perception, because the behaviour is changing to control the perception, your input. Okay, and when we don't meet that, we experience distress and a loss of control. So I've noticed that we're doing fantastically in terms of time, and we're coming up to the conflict slide, which I'm tempted to start on in a moment, but I'm also wary that we have got longer, again, for questions or comments.
So there are no questions in the chat yet, but it's important to have like a firm grasp of what is control and what control is not. So maybe if someone has questions, they are very welcome.
We've got a question there. Can perceptions be imaginary? Yeah. So all that matters to your brain is that it's getting some signals coming up inward. Okay. Whether or not that emanates from an object in the world is kind of not as relevant to that part of your brain that's experiencing that input. So yes, we can have reference points, for example, for intrusive thoughts, intrusive imageries, impulses, all kinds of internal mental and bodily experiences that may not have a current stimulus, to use the behaviorist term, in the outside world. Okay, it's the fact that we're controlling our inputs, and when we're doing that fluidly in the real world, then it will have a corresponding aspect that's going on in the environment, but that doesn't have to be the case, and we can do this process in imagination, as people are inevitably do when they're doing method levels, because they're nearly always talking about something that they are imagining. And that's an interesting possible limitation to kind of bare method levels, that you have to enter to some degree that imaginary mode. So Phil said he likes a simplified loop, but there needs a box that says the world. It's really important. Otherwise, it looks like you act. Once you act, you immediately perceive. Absolutely. I think, there's the world there in the basic loop. If you're doing imagination, then it'll loop internally, but it'll still loop through something. It's not just, you don't immediately perceive your outputs, which you're absolutely right there, Phil. So someone's asking about psychosis. I will answer the question about psychosis, but not use conflict yet, maybe just using control. I mean, one thing I can say on the practical side regarding psychosis, one practical side element of psychosis is the control element about when you have a session. So when particularly Viv Huddy and Sarah Tai, when they've used method levels in inpatient wards, they've literally met the patient as soon as they come in, said, I'm the psychologist here. If you want any chance to talk through things, just find me, or if I'm not in, fill in the timetable on my wall, and I'll see you whenever you book. Okay, they don't put anything in the way in terms of screening, referral, being psychologically minded, whatever you want to call it, between them and the client who's experienced that psychosis for which they've gone to be an inpatient. And in our experience, that makes you very accessible. It makes you even likable, because you're giving that person the control about when they talk to you, what they talk to you about. They can talk about their voices or their delusions if they want, but they can talk about something completely different if they want. And so you're not coming to them with all that assumption about what they should believe, what they should experience, what the label is for it. And so in our experience, and I've done a couple of times, I've seen someone with psychosis where that natural curiosity has just, I think, led me to find out a lot more about what they're going on through, and then get some better control over it, because I've just remained curious and they've been able to describe this bizarre perceptual experience. But I don't care. It could be any more or less bizarre than anyone else, because I'm still going to be curious, even if they're telling me a thought that I had yesterday. You know, so it's a real level playing field doing MOL, because everyone's got curiosities about their thoughts, whether they got psychosis or not. I think more could be said around what the genesis of psychosis is within the theory, which we'll come up onto, I think, when we talk about conflict and reorganization. But the main point is the theory doesn't change to explain psychosis. It's still the same theory. So Eva, looking at the other question.
Yeah, there's one question from Alex relating to this one. So when someone's perception that they are trying to control is an error or a delusion, do you address that or just work on their attempt to control that perception? So this is, if it's not real, do you still help people controlling it?
And this is, again, really good. This is good questions. They're all about, again, the spirit of method levels, okay? It's not, the method of levels is not a reality testing therapy, unlike cognitive therapy and even Rogerian counselling, who talks about reality testing. It doesn't matter to you whether someone's thoughts are real or not. It might matter to them. Well, if you're curious about that, ask them how important it is to them, okay? Your job is not to help them reality test their beliefs, whether they're everyday common beliefs or whether they're the most bizarre delusion you've ever heard. What you're interested about in terms of that belief is how important it is to them, you know, what makes them believe it, what they notice when they believe it, what else they experience, how it makes them feel when they believe it. Would they like to believe it? Would they like to believe something different? How their beliefs about it come and go, whether they always believe at the same time or amount or not. You know, I'm preempting you lots of MOL questions, none of which have got anything to do with whether that belief's true or not, because it's irrelevant to method levels therapy and fairly irrelevant to PCT if we think that what keeps problems going are the internal conflicts, which we'll come back to later, or even the conflicts between other people's goals, rather than the facts in some objective environment. Because arguably we are all a subjective experience and control of the physical world. And so PCT doesn't really care. Well, PCT does to some degree, but in MOL you're not concerned about whether it's accurate or not. From a clinical perspective, you might care about whether it's going to put them at risk or not, which is another question. But that's not your primary. Whether it reflects reality is certainly not on the top of your list of curious questions.
There's one more question that's relevant to control. If this is Dr. CHR. So does one directly control amount of anxiety, or does anxiety accompany loss of control?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. So can you control anxiety? Yeah.
So yeah, I just sprung up anxiety as a kind of an everyday familiar concept, but you know, I wasn't even using the word anxiety in any kind of research or clinical way, because I might have a word that I call anxiety. I'm going to control that. You might not even care about anxiety. You might have something called arousal that you control, or you might have something called edginess that you control. I don't care or no. Okay, so I wasn't trying to put forward some kind of theory about the nature of anxiety as some kind of research construct. Okay, I was just trying to illustrate that any of us could select something we experience and try and control it in a way that we personally experience and define that thing. Now, whether or not that thing that we try and control comes and goes more often when we're in conflict, you know, it's quite possible. Yeah. And Bill Powers certainly indicated that when we're in conflict, the stuff going on in our bodies and brains that is preparing us to act on something gets stifled, because it's like, well, I really wanted to go and give this talk, but I got so scared I just stayed in my room. You know, so you've got all this adrenaline preparing yourself, and your body doesn't know what to do with it. Okay, and that arousal hangs around. Okay, people in PCT, we don't really care what label people give to things, but there's certainly something going on in your body and brain when you're preparing and you're stifled because of conflict. So some people will choose to try and control that thing, some people won't. But yes, there's a potential two-way street there for some of the things we try and control. That it's hard because we might try and control it, but it's going to come back again, because as soon as we're in conflict, it's going to come back.
I think it's a good moment to start talking about conflict, because we end up in conflict anyway, right? Or end up talking about it anyway.
I like this one. Do emotionally unstable patients have control of anything at all? I like that. Yes, I think it's really important to not think of control as anything unitary or on or off. Okay, everything, and this is again comes into play when you do MOL. Everything is potentially on a continuum. Okay, and in practice some things might not be, but everything could be. So it's degrees of control. Okay. The other thing is that it's not like you are in control or you're not. You're controlling certain variables, certain things that matter to you. You might be not controlling other things that don't matter to you, or you might be able to control things that don't matter to you. Okay, so someone who's described as emotionally unstable patient may well be able to make themselves a cup of tea and even reassure their grandmother on the phone about their physical health problems. I don't know. So there's plenty of complicated things that someone with a label can do, but the reason they're seeking help isn't because they're out of control of their entire brains and bodies. The reason they're seeking help is that they're not in control of something that really matters to them. Okay, so they feel that they're a terrible person, or they know they can't get up in the morning and they've got really important work to do, or their family tells them that they're uncaring because of their symptoms, you know. And that might be one small facet of all the things they could possibly be controlled, but goodness knows that's something important to that person, and that's why they're coming to therapy. Does that make sense? So even our most severe patients can control probably hundreds of thousands of things in their lives. But they're coming to therapy because they can't control the things that are most important, and that the people that they care about think are most important of that.
Can you explain a bit more about the idea that control, or the relationship between control and agency? So what can you say about that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because, again, control theory is a theory about control that Bill Powers came up with because he was a control engineer who wanted to help people. He wasn't much concerned with the very long and parallel literature of psychology that uses various other words for things. Okay, so really I think it's up to people who research agency to tell us whether their concept of agency is similar to what we mean by control or not. I think it's unlikely it'd be massively different, but if you want to define control, you just use the terms that control is defined in through Bill Powell's work and through the definitions that I've put here. You know, so it's controlling your input, you know, making aspects of yourself and the world meet desired sort of internal standards through actions that you engage in to counteract disturbances, things that might pull you away from that reference point that you have internally in your own, you know, in your own brain, in your own mind. So it's up to people who do research on agency to tell us how well that maps onto their concepts of agency. But I think there will be an overlap.
Oh.
So one might think that it's a problem to be controlled by other people, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. If your partner asks you to pass the salt at dinner, they are kind of pretty much trying to control your behaviour, trying to get you to do something that they want. Are you particularly bothered by that? Not really at all. You're only going to be bothered by it if, you know, it was your last salt cellar and you're worried they're going to drop it and break it and you're not going to have any salt for your meal, for example. Okay. Maybe a more everyday example is, you know, if your boss asks you to stay working late, is that a problem? Probably is for most people, because they've got other things they want to do with their time, like stay at home with their family. So again, this comes down to this issue of when control is a problem and when it's not a problem, when it's actually an everyday part of life. And so controlling things for yourself is not necessarily a problem. Controlling other people is not necessarily a problem. But wanting to do something and wanting not to do something at the same time is the problem. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some clinical examples in a moment, but the reason why it is such a problem is because a conflict puts you in a battle with yourself. You're both spending time striving for something and striving to do the opposite of that thing. Okay, and so we need some way to help people manage those conflicts and be more flexible with their own thinking. Okay, so I'm going to kind of describe to you some clinical examples. There's one example here that Tim Carey has used. A client of his, that he asked, does it bother you that you can't get the image of your abuser out of your head? Now that question might seem like a very naive question that someone would be asked. Why would they want someone, this unpleasant person, as an image in their own head? But that client at that time answered yes and no. I need to remember it so I can keep blaming him instead of myself. I want to forget him so I can just be the person I want to be. Okay? So this is why we are so naive and curious when we ask questions, because there's always the client's own personal answer to that question. And even something that might seem self-evidently to be not a good thing. We talked about anxiety earlier. We talked, for example, about anger. Well, who wants to feel angry? Well, actually, I do want to feel angry because I know I need to feel that way to assert myself, for example. So even when it's something unpleasant, people can, at times, identify reasons, goals for why they might want that experience that they're also avoiding at the same time. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If that person was going to blame themselves for everything that happened unless they could hold that image of the perpetrator in mind, then it's vitally important to remind yourself who did this. But at the same time, if that makes you kind of feel like you can't feel sane, you can't be the person you want to be, that's not kind of something that you can hold on to as well. And you know, I'm going to give you one more example. There's two examples in the slides, but I think I'll give you another clinical example to complement the two that are on the slides, which is a client I've worked with who, again, it was about trauma, but this time it was about two different kind of reasons for her. And in fact, she went through much of her adult life trying to forget and push the memories of her problems, her trauma to one side. But when we started working in therapy, because of safeguarding, there was an opportunity where she could actually be a witness and ensure that the perpetrator of her trauma was interviewed by the police and brought to justice. But bearing in mind she spent many years trying to block these memories, now she had this other opportunity. So before she was trying not to lose control, not to feel that she was going mad. Now she wanted justice, but to get justice, she needed to provide her own statement to the police. To do that, she needed to describe everything that happened in absolute contextually accurate detail so that they knew and that the jury would know that she was a credible witness that this really did happen. So now she was at conflict with herself, because did she want to remain sane and push these memories to the back of her mind like she'd been doing for years, or did she want to bring them to mind and describe that experience so that this person could be brought to justice and that other people weren't harmed by this person? So again, a really kind of stark example of a conflict. And I would propose that you can find conflicts in any difficulty that someone's had for a period of time, and even problems that maybe some of you might identify with, like a specific phobia, if you're afraid of spiders or snakes or something. And we've done some separate research on this, and it's about people balancing that desire to want to be strong, want to kind of go into places where this thing that they're afraid of might be, to combat it, to kind of go on holiday and camping to places that they wanted to go to be a good parent, for example. They've got lots of reasons why they want to get closer to this thing, but at the same time, they want to get as far away from possible as they can, and potentially never see one again, because they're so afraid it's going to bite them, it's going to harm them, it's going to make them panic, it's going to make them lose their mind, going to embarrass themselves, etc., etc. So what we're seeing is that people are in these ambivalent states, and that's because they have these conflicting goals at a higher level, and that those goals, when you look at them by themselves, like to want justice, to want to be a good parent, to want to be sane, to want to not be blamed, they're not arguable. They don't need reality testing. They're goals that all of us could have. But the fact is, for this person at this time, some of these goals, two or more of these goals, are pushing them into conflict with themselves. And our job is to help the person describe what's going on here so that they can resolve that conflict, resolve that fight, that struggle with themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that conflicts don't happen with other people. And there are ways that you can use PCT to inform more systemic ways of doing interventions. But given you've got that one person in front of you as you're talking, the only thing you can change right now is helping them work on that internal conflict. But we maybe come back to how you manage that if what they're telling you is about what someone else is doing or saying. Okay. When we wanted to put our finger on kind of what that process is therefore that resolves the conflict, what do you notice happening for someone when they're doing so? Tim and Sarah Ty and myself focused on 4 aspects that seem to happen when people do resolve their problems. They seem to keep their attention on that problem. So if one of you have got an everyday conflict, like which friend to go out with this evening, whether to go out in the rain or not, whether to flout social distancing guidelines because you want to catch up with somebody, these everyday conflicts, I would suggest that the way you resolve them is to you at least sustain your attention on them. You notice your thoughts and feelings, impulses, memories. You allow those experiences to be thought about and potentially to be talked about. And that's what we mean by a sort of an external expression of that experience, which is often talking, but it could be drawing or doodling or painting or even music or dance. But in MOL, it's talking. So people seem to sustain their attention on the thing they're bothered about. They express it. They notice the products of their expression. They hear what they've said. They look at what they've written. And then there seems to be some kind of shift in emotional state, which you could also call connecting with a felt sense. And then maybe a bit of a way down the line, there seems to be a shift in perspective. People saying, well, that sounds ridiculous, or I didn't think of it like that before, or that's a good question, or oh yeah, things are changing for me as I'm saying that, or etc., etc. And all of these are things that we've noticed happening when people resolve their problems. As an MOL therapist, they're not things that you have to particularly concentrate on and engineer, because they will happen as you do the MOL with somebody, okay? But that is a sign that things are working. And why is it a sign that things are working? It's because there's this process called reorganization acting at the place it needs to act to make the difference, to make the change, okay? So reorganization is a name given to the learning process in perceptual control theory. It's actually the way that we developed all of our goals and our preferences in the first place during infancy. And there's separate work on this by a chap called Franz Ploy, who's had a long history of work on this with detailed observational studies in animals and human infants. And I've got a fabulous parenting book called The Wonder Weeks, which just spells all this out. And reorganization is the process through which we learn those things. It's the process through which we resolve conflicts at a very basic level when we were kids learning to walk and talk and work out what kind of friends we wanted to be with and TV programs we wanted. But it's also the process that we're going to use, we all use, to make everyday decisions that we don't have a predetermined answer for. And it's the process that our patients or the people that we want to help are going to be using and are using all the time. And some of the people with the most severe mental health problems are some of the most creative people that have ever walked the earth. They're reorganizing, okay? They're not necessarily reorganizing in the place that they need to reorganize to solve the problem that they've come to you for, okay? Your job as an MOL therapist is to help them shift and sustain that change process, which is a trial and error, open-ended change process, onto where it really is going to make a difference, where it's actually going to resolve the problem in the long run. So according to our work, that is the active ingredient of all types of therapy, whether they're MOL or not. And they happen when people change, and even when they change in natural recovery. But method levels is something that distills this process. So we pride ourselves in trying to deliver that process as efficiently and directly as possible. And part of that reason is because we've let go of all that other baggage about what a therapist is to do method levels, okay? We're not interpreting. We're not giving our own formulations. We're not giving homework. Our ego is out of the park, you know. We're just curious and we're just listening, and we're letting go of all that other baggage, so that the only thing we're doing is to help shift and sustain awareness of the client in front of us, okay? And that's the learning process, is to learn to let go of that baggage that is partly your own personality and partly your other training. That doesn't mean you're not yourself when you do it. You are, just as I'm myself when my 4-year-old is shouting at me from downstairs. And actually, the more you learn method levels, the more you can actually do this in a more natural way, having a conversation with somebody, and don't feel like you've got to bring in this whole kind of rigmarole of what the therapist should be and what the therapeutic relationship should be. Okay. What else does it mean if we think that reorganization is a thing? There's certainly lots of research on it. It means that the solutions to our problems will be successful when both sides of the conflict are accommodated in some way. So we don't have to push someone to one goal or the other, or one value or the other. We recognize people have multiple values they might want to uphold in their lives. Solutions will probably be unpredictable and novel. We don't know what they're going to be and when they're going to come to them. So we've not got some predetermined behavioural experiment that's going to end up in the right solution. The time's going to vary between people. The first option might not be the right one. Sometimes things might get worse before they get better. The change process won't be linear. There'll be ups and downs. It's unlikely to just involve some logical solution. There'll be this experiential, spontaneous aspect to it. And part of what you're helping the client do is allow that spontaneity in their own mind's eye. Your advice isn't going to be that much help. If you're really lucky, it might be for the right person at the right time. But that bit of advice was not part of Method Levels if that's what you end up doing. Your Method of Levels is just the curious questions. And sometimes when we get stuck in a rut with someone, it might well be because we've ended up out of this mode of listening and we've ended up being on one side of this conflict. And that's what other therapists call resistance. And if we can keep our wits about them, we're going to get less of that with Method Levels. And like I said before, it's about people getting themselves better. It's about awareness, which other therapies are well aware of, that we want to be enhancing and enriching people's awareness. But we're doing it during a conversation about the problem at hand. We're not requiring someone to do 45 minutes a day mindfulness training, okay? That will probably help people, but in our kind of mind's eye, that's not the most efficient way of helping them navigate their own awareness to where it needs to go to deal with the problem at hand, okay? And so our job is to do it in this very natural way, this awareness raising, enriching process. And now I'm going to share with you actually what it is then, is having the two goals. It's focusing your mind on two things. The first one's probably your foundation and your starting point and your touchstone, which is just to help them talk freely about the problem. Ask about the problem. Ask about what they want to talk about. And when they've told you about it, ask again. Because there's always something in the way they've described their problem that's incomplete and you're curious about. So keep asking about the different facets of the problem from different angles, and you're intrigued about whether the problem's still the same now as it was 2 minutes ago. So you're asking about the problem right now, and we notice working when people start to tell us, well, I could just talk openly and freely to you with this, and you're allowing that mode of expression. That is your fundamental. And then every so often, you are going to what we call ask about a disruption or notice a disruption. A disruption is something that you notice them doing on the surface, which may or may not be tied into something they're experiencing from their mind's eye as a perception, which you could call a background thought, because often it's a thought at the back of their mind, but it might not be. It might be a feeling that's there, something in their body, an image, and they're noticing their own kind of smile or their own shift in impulses. You are interested both in the foreground of the wording of the problem, the expression of it, but you've got your eye out for what might be in the background. You're not going to read anyone's body language because there's no prizes for being clever doing Method Levels. You get extra prizes for being stupid in Method Levels. You've got to just listen and watch and ask if there's anything else going on, because you've noticed a disruption. Now, you could say that to them, or you could just, what happened there? Oh, was the pause about something? Or, wow, you really smiled when you said that. What was that all about? Or, when you said that word, why did you say heaviness like that? You know, so you're curious, not just about what's there in the logic of what they said, but in the tone and style and pace and features of what they say. Not because you're going to interpret it, but because you genuinely wondered whether there was something else going on when they said that. And the idea is that then you catch the background thoughts, some of which sometimes it might be a feeling or an image or a memory. Other times it might be, oh, well, yeah, I don't really want that. It might be a facet of the conflict. Other times it might be a whole new kind of, wow, it just sounded ridiculous when I said it like that. What do you mean ridiculous? Well, you know, in my life, I try and, you know, so they're going up to the level of something to do with their everyday lives, for example. So that's your job. Your job isn't to kind of focus on any one of those. Your job is to help them talk about a problem and keep noticing those background thoughts, because they will probably pave your way to the conflict, and they'll pave your way up levels. One metaphor I like to think about is, it's as though your client is going into a house that they're unfamiliar with. You're not in the house with them. They're on a mobile phone. It's a bit of a dark house and they've got a flash torch in front of them, okay? Now, you're not telling them where to shine it, but you want them to tell you what they see when they're shining the torch. And when they see something, you want them to tell you what colour it is, where it is, what's next to it, whether it's changing. And you're generally curious whether there's other stuff going on there as well, okay? And just as if you went into a pretty creepy house for the first time, or a strange, interesting house for the first time, you probably wouldn't race straight to the top floor and shout, "I found the solution!" You know, you'd want to explore. You'd want to explore the first floor, describe that in detail, get intrigued, and then open the next door to see whether Narnia's there, or it's, you know, you're falling into Alice's looking glass. You know, so you are then opening opportunities, or they are opening opportunities, and you're giving them choices about whether to go to the next level or not. All of the time, you're not in there, you can't see it, you've just got words as your kind of conduit. But you're using those words to formulate your next question. Not because you're going to summarize it, not because you're going to interpret it, not that it even matters that you even understand what they're telling you, but because it gives you the next best question to ask that's going to help them explore and experience and describe it for themselves. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, because everything else is just specifics that some people might do or might not do, depending on what someone comes up with. So, Eva, have you noticed any questions or comments that would be good now?
No, I think everyone was intently listening and not asking questions. So feel free to open your microphone and ask a question now, or put it in the chat. Because we're now at slides like 32, 33, 44, right? Yeah.
And I'm going to skate through some of the others. They're going to be more for personal use. Okay. Well, I will carry on though, because give us more time.
I have a question. Took me a while to find my mute button. You talked about asking naive questions, and one thing that comes up for me is occasionally, like sometimes it's great and they like grab on, and other times it makes them bristle a little bit. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you do when that happens. I mean, one thing you can do is go into the bristling, right, and ask about that. But sometimes that's a real distraction from the work that you're supposed to be doing. Yeah. What do you do when you say something that lands just wrong?
Yeah.
Or so when they can't deal with the question? Yeah.
I always fall back on the fact that this is meant to be a client-led session, okay? Because control is critical. So I always say, you know, oh, is it okay if I ask about this? Am I talking about what you want to talk about? Is this the problem you wanted to talk about? And sometimes I might have started and then, oh, is it okay? How's this going, talking about this right now? Is this the way you want to go about it? You know, so I'm just getting their permission to do it, or if I've not got permission, then giving them other options about what to talk about and how. So whilst we think that probably in the long run, the roads to these solutions will involve a bit of gristle, there's no need that has to happen right here, right now. You know, it's going to be up to that person. And you know, when I was talking to my friend last night, and he said, you know, my therapist, because the other thing about method levels is we don't have this rule that you can't have more than one therapist. You know, I don't mind if my friend has got other therapists he sees, because I'm not going to give him any advice anyway. So it's not going to conflict with what any other therapist is going to say. But his therapist had said, go home and, you know, write for 20 minutes solidly about your problem. And, you know, I just asked him, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, I tried and I couldn't, and it was too much. And I said, well, you know, what do you think is the best thing? He goes, well, I'll just do it when I'm ready to do it. Okay. I say, okay, yeah. Is that what you want to do? Yeah. Okay. So, you know, people can do that gristle, do that facing the dark stuff or the tough bits or the messy stuff as and when they're ready. And that's so important that we tell people it's for when they're ready to do it. But at the same time, in the next question you ask, there might be something gristly about it, you know, and, you know, that wasn't your intention, but, you know, and you're going to ask lots of different things to try and help that road be one that they are ready and willing to go up. Does that make sense? Yeah, Alex is nodding.
Yeah, and fair. Yeah, and I need that reminder a lot, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Like I forget and I get an agenda, and then that's when I don't like them bristling, or I think it's important that we go there or whatever. And that's the part that I appreciate the reminder about. Thanks.
Yeah. Super. Okay, I'm just going to say a little bit more about what it looks like then. And again, I think it's Sarah and Tim put together some of these slides. They're really nice little examples of what method levels can look like. So as I'm saying, it's not about teaching or telling people what to do, guiding or pushing them in a certain direction, leading them, suggesting things that they should do. It's about exploring, discovering, being playful, learning stuff, making connections, noticing connections. And as I say, it's about having those curious questions. And I'm just going to, I will read out this example. So if someone says to you, if this glimmer of hope goes away, I will just forget my needs and isolate myself. Okay. Now there's so much potentially that you could ask about in that phrase. How sure are you of that right now? How does that sound to say that out loud? How much of the hope would need to go before you forget your needs? What are you thinking of as you're telling me? What does forgetting your needs mean? How does that work? You could be asking, how bright is the glimmer? How much would you have to isolate yourself? Do you know where you'd isolate yourself? So there's so many things just in that phrase that you could ask about. And the point of method levels isn't about asking the right question. It's about asking lots of different questions, okay? And sometimes what someone's telling you will evolve over a conversation, and it's about keeping them focused on that topic and asking around it and with it. And so there's a lot of kind of wrong things you can do, but there are so many different right questions you can ask. And what makes it right isn't the specific one, it's the fact that you're remaining really flexible and varied and open-ended in the kinds of questions you ask and the different angles you come at different times. And so sometimes we get method level therapists who get stuck into a bit of a habit about asking, how does that feel? Or asking, what's going through your mind right now? or asking, why did you smile just then? And none of those are bad questions, but if that was a habit you got into, and they were your main type of questions, or even if they were like, you know, at least 20% of your questions, that would be too much of the same kind of thing, really. You know, you need to kind of, because you're so open-ended and you're so curious about the way what they're saying is evolving, your questions are just going to be so varied. And they're not going to be just about feelings. They're going to be about thoughts and impulses and behaviors and images. And they're not just going to be about smiles. They're going to be about pauses and grimaces and jumps back and emphasize words. You know, they're going to be all about this huge kind of range of things you could be asking about. Okay.
There's a question from Rupert.
Yeah.
What if someone is very unresponsive or unable to express their feelings or thoughts?
Yeah, so really important. If someone's unresponsive, first check that they're not dead or need CPR, because that is far more important than doing method levels with them. But if you really mean unresponsive as in they're not answering you in a kind of a verbally descriptive way, then one important thing is to make them realize that they can talk about what they want to talk about, okay? And it may be that you've got stuck on some assumption they're going to talk that they meant to talk about a certain problem, maybe because someone they knew referred them or something, and they think, well, this is all about my depression, isn't it? Well, no, it's what you want to talk about. So they actually talk to you about, you know, their difficulties learning to play the drums. You know, they can focus on what they want to talk about is an important thing. The other thing is that you don't need them to express feelings. Yes, we notice emotional change when people shift, but all you want them to do is to be able to express something that they're experiencing, and that thing should normally be something that's not working quite right. So you can word it as, is there something about, you know, the way things are going now that's not how you want it to be? You know, can we help you make things more as you want them to be? So it does need to be a problem, but a problem can be as mild as not quite reaching your potential, you know, or a problem that someone else has that you'd rather they didn't have, you know. So part of it is about kind of finding a territory that they can be expressive about. The other possibilities, it might just be not the right time, in which case they can come back another time when they want to express and talk about that thing. I do think we reserve PCT informed clinical interventions that are not method levels as well, which is not the focus of this training. But what you need to remember for this training is this is how you use PCT when you've got someone in front of you who wants to talk about a problem, okay? This is not a training workshop in all the possible ways perceptual control theory could reduce mental health problems in our society, okay? There are a lot more ways we can use PCT to resolve mental health problems. And you probably need to sort of look at other things that I've written and researched and that other people have used that have been informed by PCT for that. This is how you use PCT in a conversation to help someone work through a problem. Does that answer it, Rupert? Okay, so just some pointers around those goals. It's about focusing on what's happening to the client, on their process of thinking and feeling and noticing. You're not interpreting, you're not guessing, you're trying to notice if you're making assumptions and sort of stepping outside that. You don't need to try to be empathic. You don't say, oh, that must be terrible for you. I'm so pleased I'm not in your shoes right now. You know, you're not trying to be empathic. But what we find is that when you genuinely care so much that you want to be curious about what someone's telling you, that feels empathic anyway. It's like, well, it felt I felt so contained and supported because you really wanted to know what happened to me, you know. So don't worry if you're a kind of person who likes to think they're empathic. Doing this will mean you're empathic anyway without trying to be empathic, okay? and obviously avoid giving advice. I think we covered that. And really, just a lot of slides for now. Just part of this is about keeping that naivety about what could be going on. And it's also about attuning to different properties of the world. And if you think about it, this is what Bill Powers built his theory on. Out of anything that we experience, there could be different properties of it. You know, the size, the shape, the vividness, the color, the change over time. You know, now we're not going to use these technically like Bill did, but we are going to be interested in those same qualities of what someone's describing to us. Sometimes because that's actually going on, sometimes because it's a metaphor for what is a problem they're not putting into words. And so just keep that curiosity going. So if someone says, this is a really big problem, how big is it? Is it always the same size? Does it ever get bigger or smaller? And people say something like, I just want to push this really far away. Or how far away is it now? How far do you want it? You know, how do you do that? How hard do you need to push, etc. If people say, well, it just comes into me and it just overwhelms me. Well, where's it coming from? How quickly does it overwhelm you? What makes you know that it's got overwhelming, you know, etc. And if people describing that concept of space, just ask about things in a spatial way. And sometimes people can have some very elaborate metaphors, and there's a video link to Doug Turkington talking about his kind of a metaphor of a dam that he was putting up, and Tim Carey's asking now about the shape and the size of it, the distance from it, etc., etc. So really, any quality of what someone's telling you, whether it's real or metaphorical, you can ask about. And sometimes we use metaphorical words without having a metaphor in mind. So, you know, this is so heavy, man. Right? Well, how heavy is it? You know, is it as heavy as other problems that you've had? Now, they may not be deliberately trying to use a metaphor, but you can still gear into that word to ask them a question that is in the zone already with the language that they're using. And you might ask about feelings, you might not. You tend to gravitate towards the modality that the person's in. If they're a feeling-y person, you're probably going to ask about feelings because they're already talking to you about them. If they're talking to you about thoughts, you're probably going to gravitate in that way. You might have an eye looking out to see if there's a feeling at the back when someone's talking in logical thoughts, or have an eye open for a logical thought when someone's talking in feelings, but you're generally just moving with their kind of modality. And things change over time. So don't be scared about asking the same question 5 minutes later, because sometimes things might have changed, you know. And sometimes when you will be saying, well, you know, what do you want to do right now? And sometimes people take that to mean this week. And so you might need to ask it again. No, actually, right now, what do you want to do? You know, so that you're kind of honing in and helping them answer the question, focusing not always on the present, but if you're expecting something to change, you're going to need to keep checking in on that thing. Okay. So I've got a little bit about evidence, and then I'm going to kind of leave it open and Eva can select the questions. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because I think evidence is things that people can read. But what I want to say is that we work a lot with individual public clinicians, such as in our NHS service, and we've worked with quite a few now clinical social enterprises, including 6 Degrees Social Enterprise in Salford. My wife has a social enterprise in Rochdale called Beyond Psychology. Susan McCormack runs her own charity down in Stockport called Mode Rehabilitation. Cuba has his Restore Control enterprise. So we've got a large number of agencies that we work with, and we get feedback as we go along. We get feedback from people that they train, and we take that in and we use it, and sometimes we published it. But essentially, you know, they like the fact that we're flexible, that they can control and determine things, that they can be enabled and empowered to solve their own problems. when it comes down to what's the research evidence base out there, Tim Carey has done by far the most kind of extensive studies. They are very strong in the sense that they've been delivered in mental health services to non-kind of screened populations. So they weren't kind of screened out for severity or certain kinds of problems. And they kind of were providing data on kind of clinical outcomes. Those symptoms, that level of distress, changed over time. It's changed in what's described as a large effect size, which is comparable or more than similar practical studies in clinical services. And so there's a slide on that, number 45. And Tim also did one study to show that method levels was more efficient than these other service-based studies. Like I said before, we've not got any large-scale studies where we've directly compared method levels with other interventions out there. We did do a very short-term pilot trial, which is about all we could manage within the frames of a PhD in a primary care mental health service over a 3-month window. And over that time, people either got method levels or they got whatever CBT sessions they've had in those 3 months. And in that kind of study, we found that in method levels, they were at least doing as well as the people in the CBT group. So it was having that impact on the stress. And again, you can see that slide. I think I'll probably put that out on ResearchGate quite soon. We have applied for several grants, but not received the funding to date. At the moment, I'm putting my energies into a digital version of method levels, but that is another topic. But I do want to summarize latest findings, not just because it's the research base, but because it reminds us what we're striving for this type of therapy. So a group of undergraduates and Vanessa McIntyre, a current PhD student, did some work looking at videos of method levels and videos of other therapies and focusing on what was different. And method levels was very different from these other therapies. They found that the clients in method levels, when you added up all the time that they were talking over the duration of the session, they were talking for a much longer portion of that session than in any of the other therapies. Okay, so it was somehow bringing much more out of the clients in terms of the duration of expression, number of words, however you want to count it. They were just enabled to say more. Okay, and that makes sense because in method levels therapy, you shouldn't be saying anything unless it's a curious kind of question or comment that helps the client just continue to describe what's going on for them. But interestingly, but again, totally in keeping, the MOL therapists asked 3 times as many questions as any other therapy, and it was nearly all just questions. And they interrupted and said, I think, about at least 2 times as many utterances as the other therapists. So what you're doing in method levels therapy is you're coming in regularly with a curious kind of scaffold to their awareness, but largely they are doing more of the talking, but you're interrupting quite a lot to help them do more talking. And when you interrupt, you're not going to summarize, you're not going to pontificate, you're not even going to establish a long time forming a sentence. You're just going to say, how's that going for you? Tell me all about that. Or you're going to just really say enough to help them know what you're asking, but you're not going to take the spotlight away from the clients. Okay. We did another session where people watched videos of themselves doing MOL, and we found, like we expected, that those moments where the client felt more in control and more able to talk freely were the ones that they also thought were most helpful. We've also done work looking at the shift in awareness, where we've tried to code that independently, which is going to have limitations, but it tends to fit with what we're looking for in the theory. And we've done research looking at the effects of asking about disruptions, which does tend to be asked at a time when people are kind of about to go up a level and talk about something more foundational. And we've got a measure that just is a kind of just a kind of sense that people have that they are able to talk about being in two minds, to tolerate a bit of uncertainty, to manage thoughts popping in, to not have the first answer to everything. This kind of idea that we're cultivating this sustained workspace for people, and people tend to say, yes, I'm more like that with myself, having done method levels. Okay, and that research is in various stages. Some of it's published, and it's got strengths and limitations, but it kind of together, I would say, kind of answers these questions that we're looking at. There are actually 4 different manuals for method levels. Most recently was a book that Tim Carey first authored and is linked on the preparation materials. Before that, I first authored one that was really for an audience of people that had done cognitive behaviour therapy. Before that, Tim Carey wrote one called Hold That Thought, which is, you can read it in half an hour and it's a lovely start to method levels. And then his first book in 2006 is like a foundational kind of pure description of method levels and the theory. So there's a lot there that you could get your teeth into. But I just want to summarise a few things now, because I think it's kind of, and do something with you before there's a possibility of a few more questions. Again, there's links to websites, including the Dutch website, on the slides and the preparation materials. So we've got, and thank everyone for making this possible in the time that I've done. And I do hope I haven't rushed through it. I really believe that you guys have got enough information at your disposal to just get going practicing method levels. You might want to practice it in written form first, or just with someone you really trust first, or someone you never met first. I don't know. You just need to find a way of doing it, practicing it, that works for you, and do the facilitation. And thanks again to facilitators. But we've got five minutes or so for any other questions. So Eva, what do you think I should be?
Let me organize. There's many thank yous, so let's not miss those. Yeah. There's a question about the 2 principles and later 2 goals on PCT. I think.
Okay. So yes. So the 2 goals of method levels are ask about the problem and ask about disruptions. The principles of PCT are control, conflict, and reorganization. Okay. So when you're doing method levels, you should only have to think about the 2 goals. Ask about the problem, ask about disruptions. But whenever you need to kind of justify why you're doing method levels, and to kind of get into the right stance to make yourself feel comfortable and comforted and willing to take that risk, then you need to know PCT and why those principles in the theory are, let's say, correct, let's say evidence-based, are supported, are valid, are kind of, the basics of it. And sometimes when we're doing supervision, we just do method levels. Other times we're like, well, what does PCT tell us? Well, let's look at control here. Let's look where the conflict might be here, etc. But just to keep things so acute while you're doing method levels, just focus on the 2 goals.
If this is not entirely people who are familiar with PCT or very familiar with it, could you talk about what you mean by disruption?
I did, but then I'm thinking about it. I think I might have skated over something. So the disruption, again, is something that you detect that might be indicating a background thought. And a background thought is something that's going on when the person is talking about the problem, but it's not the wording of the problem. So the disruption might be a pause, it might be a smile, it might be the tone of voice, it might be increase or decrease in volume, It's something that's going on and kind of in a separate channel, if you like, whilst the person's telling you the content of their problem. Sometimes it literally is a disruption. They literally just kind of freeze and stop. You know, what happened there? Other times it's kind of disrupting, but they carry on talking anyway. If you watch sports people being interviewed about their performance, footballers or gymnasts or whatever, you'll see what I mean. There's a lot of disruptions going on there as they censor what they're saying and relive their performance. Any other questions? Something that's you're gonna need to ask to get going, to get off your butt and start doing meta levels with people. What do you need to know the answer to? Because if you don't ask a question, then you've not got any excuse.
So one question from Maureen Lyland is, do you explain the principles of method of levels to your clients in your first sessions?
It's all on a need-to-know basis, and I find that most people need to know that I'm going to ask them questions about the problem they're telling me about, and to do so I might be interrupting, and I'm doing it to help them explore their problem in more detail. So that's the kind of the basics I nearly always tell people. Besides that, it's very much on a need-to-know basis. So if they want to know more about it, then we might have kind of information sheets in the service. We might gear them to the Method Levels website. What I'm not going to do is waste precious time helping them to talk about their problem, to pontificate about the theory and to socialize them in the model and to sell terminology to them, etc. And sometimes that's the way it goes. So, and we won't explain how it's different from other therapies unless that is a clincher for people. They say, well, I've had loads of other therapy before. Why? I'm not sure about this because it won't be any different. So, well, what did you have before? Okay. And did you find it was that? Yeah, well, this is different in this way. So if it's something that they need to know to start, then you tell them. If they don't need to know it to start it, you don't need to tell them.
There's an interesting question from Lyndall. He says, one of the issues I struggled with early with MOL was the notion that we don't work on a problem unless it's a problem with a client. Can you say anything about that?
Well, I guess I want to know what the struggle is, because I mainly find people don't turn up unless they've got some problem to talk to me about. I don't know if there's any more detail.
Lyndall, is that okay for you, or is there more? Okay.
Sometimes people come because someone else has told them they've got a problem, in which case it's really important to make it clear very early on that that may or may not be the case, and that what other people think is a problem might overlap, but might not. It's up to them to talk about what matters to them.
So sometimes we think clients come to us because they have a problem, and mostly they do, but sometimes they come to complain about their partner or their spouse. But one of the issues I had, I mean, kind of dramatic issues, it was like an issue of a pedophile. If it's not a pedophile, if it's not an issue for them, is it a problem that we work on? That kind of thing.
We are going to encounter, and I don't plan to cover issues of risk to the self and others in this workshop, but doing method of levels in no way kind of should take your mind away from doing the kind of risk assessments and management that you'd normally do. Now, there will be ways you can bring PCT to risk assessment and risk management, and sometimes method levels can help you assess and manage risk, but don't try and squeeze it in. Just do the best risk management and assessment that you know how to do. And if you've got risk sorted, talk to the person about whatever they want. So we do work on method levels with people in inpatient wards where there are known current risks. We make sure those risks are mitigated against, but still offer people method levels if they want it. That makes sense. One more minute. Every other question you can ask to your facilitator.
And I also wanted to point out that we have a PCT community on the web, and it's gathering at a discourse forum.
Yeah.
I put a link in the chat, and it's still a growing community, but it would be really nice if also more method of levels practitioners and starters would come there and share their questions. So find your way around that, and we can also use that as a way to find each other. So if you want to organize intervision sessions, whatever.
Yeah, and so I'm expecting your feedback to come mainly through the feedback online form and through your facilitators, and we'll use that to work out what you guys need next.
Yeah, yeah. So that's also an important goal for us, right? How to have more method of levels practitioners all over the world and spread the method. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And Eva, you'll send me your print screens, is that right? You email those to me?
I'll send them to you, and we'll find a place to that. And I'll also link to the method to the Twitter handles of you and me. And
or you could tweet it and I can retweet it. Yeah, brilliant.
I'll make that work. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm a real stickler for time, so it's 4 o'clock.
Very well.
4:01. Okay. So it's great to see all you guys, everybody. It's been brilliant, and it's so I could go on, but good luck with what you plan to do, and I really hope that you get a lot out of your facilitator sessions, and keep in touch.